I know this is completely unrelated, but they're giving away a free Auroron in version 5.5. In the patch they're making bro near irrelevant, they decide to just throw in a consolation prize of, oh yeah, here's Auroron by the way, and I just find that really funny. Anyways, hello there, Flip here, and today we're going to be going over the data mined version 5.5 banners. It's shaping up to be quite a good banner in which the characters are Varesa obviously, then Xianyun rerun finally, Venti rerun as expected, and Xilonen already, which I don't think anyone thought was happening soon. But we need to have a serious talk about Xilonen as there's some things I already want to say about her. And of course we will be talking about and going over the value of the characters in this patch as well as their signature weapons, and if their early constellations are worth going for. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. Channel members, thank you for your continued support, as always it means the world to me, and with that, let's begin. So we don't actually have a leaked banner order yet, but I think I can make an estimated guess that they will be Varesa and Xianyun together on one half, with Venti and Xilonen on the other. That would just make the most sense to me to pair the two plunge characters together, and I think it would be the best pairing overall. And Varesa is the poster 5.5 star, so let's talk about her first. She's an electro DPS and her playstyle revolves around chaining multiple plunge combos in a row to deal damage, in which her plunges are enabled through her skill or burst. Mechanically speaking, compared to someone like Chaska or Nuvolette, she's a much more involved character, as you constantly have to keep track of her combos, which is somewhat complex by Genshin standards, so you can't just play her on autopilot if that's something that matters to you. With Varesa's value, she's a DPS and she's thankfully shaping up to be at least top 3 numbers wise in the game, assuming she or Yansan don't get nerfed in the beta. And it's very weird to rank Varesa's value as she only really has 2 teams, being either Hypercarry Plunge with Xianyun or Chevru's teams, so if you have the means to build either of those teams, then I can really recommend pulling for her if you want another strong damage dealer on your account, or if you just like her. Otherwise, Varesa's other teams like Dendro stuff aren't good enough to where I can say pick up Varesa and she'll carry your account. That just isn't the reality. At the very least, Chevru's is a 4-star and Xianyun is in this version, so most of you should be able to build Varesa teams with no issues hopefully, and if you are fine with a more mechanically involved playstyle, Varesa will be a great addition to your account. A DPS is just a DPS unit, you'll feel their impact the least if you plan on skipping them, as most of them are good enough to where it doesn't really matter which ones you pull as long as you have the best teams for them, and you like their playstyle of the character itself. Now moving on, let's talk about Xianyun now, who will most likely be along Varesa in the first half. She has a weird place in the meta to where her teams have gotten stronger over time, it's just that no one really wants to play her teams. Cloud Retainer is an Onimo Catalyst support who is a team-wide healer and is also able to enable everyone to do plunging attacks. And not only that, but she adds an extremely strong flat buff to those plunging attacks as well, making them hit like a truck. On release, her best teams ranged from Zhao of course, Hu Tao double Hydro Plunge, Gaming teams, Diluc, and you could also use the Furina C6 Bena and melee DPS core to make any character a strong plunge carry. And not only that, but she did have extremely strong teams with Geo carries as well. Both Plunge Navia and Ito teams were actually competitive, if not better than using characters with their other teams, but now with Xilonen in the game, that isn't necessarily the case for Geo carries. And even with Hu Tao, Xilonen is also more preferred generally, which did lower Xianyun's value. And even with the solo Hydro Plunge Vape teams, there were some issues with it, mainly being Furina. Her Hydro application is quite inconsistent, and on top of that, in single target, Xianyun will swirl away the Hydro aura, making it so that there's a very real chance you just lose out on some vapes. Which, since the team was like 8 plunges, missing a vape was very big to the overall damage output and didn't feel that great. Despite this, plunge teams for a very long time were still good, but of course over a year of not getting any new teammates or receiving buffs, it did cause the team to stagnate and by extension Xianyun. But thankfully things did change with the release of Sitlali, who was a pretty substantial buff to plunge teams. She gave easier setups to the team as she wasn't always applying her element, allowing a set like Verdescent to be much easier used. And since Sitlali's cryo application is on a strict interval, you won't run into the Furina issue to where the element you want to react with just doesn't get applied. So plunge melt teams have just become the most consistent and best way to play pyro plunge teams, which is really nice for characters like Diluc and Gaming who see the most benefit. And while her other teams like Hu Tao and Navia are no longer the best for said carries, there are still something she can do that isn't significantly worse than her other options, while freeing up a support for the other side in the process. And she's also shaping up to be a great teammate for Varesa if you plan on getting her. Overall, if you play Zhao, Diluc or Gaming, then Xianyun is close to a must pull for you. And for everyone else who can take advantage of plunge teams but it's not their best team, it's something you can consider if you want to explore the playstyle. She's also just a really good Onimo healer in general if that's something you value. Next up we have Venti. So Venti is an Onimo bow user whose primary use is grouping, and that's about all he does, or the only reason to pull him essentially. I'm not even really going to try and cope with this. Venti is pretty unsellable as a unit, until we get the occasional full AoE sides of the Abyss. But if you do look outside of the Abyss, he's one of the better theater characters whenever Onimo's in season. But yeah, that's about it. He doesn't do a whole lot, nor does he really have strong defined teams. Most of the time he's just going to be that flexible character you slap on when grouping is important, and that's really it. So at the very least, you wouldn't struggle to slow him into teams, as he works as a really good fill slow, I guess. For his best synergies, assuming there's grouping, he's really good in Wanderer teams. You would build him with crit to take advantage of Farazan's buffing, and Wanderer's AoE is enough to where he can consistently hit enemies inside Venti's black hole. There's also Morgana teams if you want to go back to 2020, and you also have double Onimo teams which are extremely fun to use, the best being with Furina and Auroron. Then your second Onimo can be anyone really, it doesn't matter that much. Although your best results should generally come from Kazuha or Mizuki. Venti's main issue is just that he doesn't really have any supportive capabilities besides VV, but that isn't even anything special to him, as that's something any Onimo character can use. There is also his energy refund, which is pretty nice, but it doesn't justify a team slot. And not only that, but for his elemental burst, it kind of does nothing in a lot of cases, as bosses can't be grouped, and even a lot of elite tier enemies can't be grouped either as well unless you have freeze on the team, leaving very little cases for actually relevant content where you'd need his grouping. Overall, I'd only pull for Venti if you want a time saver for the older domains, you just want to complete your Archon collection, or if you just like characters for the theater. Besides that, you aren't really missing much at all if you decide to skip him. The last character we're going to be talking about in this video is Xilonen, whose kit is thankfully very simple. She's able to shred multiple different elemental resistances at the same time, and she's a Natlan character, so she can therefore use the scroll set. And being Geo allows her to enable the use of the Petra set universally, which is a great supportive set you can use on your other teammates. Before Silali's release, I think I would have called her close to a must pull, but now not so much. Which I know sounds crazy, but hear me out. The issue with Xilonen is the fact that we haven't gotten a new supportive set, which is quite literally half of her value. The moment Silali came out, this proposed a problem as gearing became awkward to where one of the characters had to nerf themselves in order for the other to shine, which most of the time was Xilonen, as she doesn't need to burst every rotation, leading to Xilonen having to use instructors or Petra. And while those sets aren't bad by any means, they just introduce awkwardness into the team, as the buff uptime on the sets aren't nearly long enough to support your carry's full damage window. And this is something that happens whenever you want to pair two Natlan supports together. And for Movuka team specifically, Xilonen is the least important member, and the character you lose the least amount of damage from replacing. You can very easily sub her out for Sucrose and see similar if not better results. And with the upcoming release of Xianyun, she just gaps Xilonen on this team by a ton, as again, Xilonen is the weakest link on the team, with her biggest upside just being her front-loaded night cell consumption from Malvika's burst, which honestly doesn't end up being that big of an issue, assuming you already have a second Natlan support in the team like Sitlali, or soon to be Xianyun. Regardless, she still is extremely flexible and opens the door for stronger teams on HP scalers, as well as with Navia, so it's not like I'm saying she's useless or anything, just that as we get more Natlan supports and no new supportive sets as strong as Scroll, it does diminish her value. I would still say to try and get her though, especially if you main Nuvolette, Muulani, Navia, Hutao, Risley, or any Cryomelt DPS, and Arlecchino to an extent, as she gives extremely comfortable setups for those characters and I don't see her getting replaced in those teams as easily. So for overall pull or value priority, I'd put Xianyun at the top if you want to main Diluc, Gaming, or Zhao, and then Xilonen number 1 for everyone else, Varesa or low priority Xianyun at 3rd depending on what type of teams you want to play, or if you value having another carry, and lastly Venti, because good lord. But if you want to know what you should really be pulling for, Xianyun Constellations. I have a few videos planned, but this Xianyun character is ludicrous from the calcs I've done, literally being a second Bennett for a majority of characters in the game, as well as enabling Chlorinde, Raiden, Malvika, Chaska, Kinich, and Varesa's strongest teams. This is a character that you really just don't want to miss out on, so no joke, I'd recommend trying to pull and sniping at the minimum a C2 Xianyun, because skipping the banner that she's on would be tantamount to skipping Bennett, which, yeah, Xianyun impact. On everyone's soul, except mine, she will be surviving the beta. We can now talk about the weapon banners, in which we have Crane's Echoing Call and Vivid Notions, which is Varesa's signature. For Varesa and her early Constellations versus her weapon, both kind of suck. Unless something is being missed that we don't know currently, Varesa's early Constellations are horrible, with the jump from C0 to C2 only being a 20% damage increase, which is half of what the value usually is, especially for modern carries. And regarding her signature weapon, Widzith is just too strong of an option, to where it isn't actually that much worse than her sig, which again, the gap between a signature and the best 4-star is usually bigger than this, so if things stay the same as they do now, you should wait for my final Varesa guides to find out. Also, once again, again, thank you Venti for the calculations. If you want to know more about Varesa instantly, then check out his Twitch streams. If you want my honest recommendation, I would keep pulling her cons just to get Xianyun copies, or I would try to invest into her best supports like Farina cons or Xianyun's. Which, speaking of Xianyun, if you have the means to do so, I would just go for her Constellations and try to get her C2 over her weapon, as her C2 is so much stronger than just getting her weapon that it's worth the pulls, and her C1 is also good for exploration while making her ERX more manageable in first rotations, which is nice. So just aim for the C2, her weapon by itself isn't worth it. And even if you only end up getting C1, that's still nice for quality of life. Now for the Elegy and Peak Patrol Song banner, this is a banner you should really consider assuming you don't have one of the weapons, as both Elegy and Peak Patrol Song are pretty universally some of the best weapons in the game, even if you don't own either of the characters it's attached to. For Venti, please don't get Venti Constellations. And for Xilonen, it does depend. Her C2 is always better than her weapon, but the gap on Pyro and Electro teams isn't that much, where there's a much bigger gap on Geo and Hydra teams. If you have the means to go for her C2, I'd recommend doing it, especially if you are a Navia, Nuvola, or Mualani main. Otherwise, just having her weapon is good enough and you don't need to pull 2 cons for it. But with that, there's nothing else much to say. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts, as I'd love to hear it and respond to almost every single comment. The channel members, as always, I'm grateful for your continued support. It means the world to me, and I appreciate all of you. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.